Hey guys, it's me, Dr. Reed, and in this video we're going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system is designed for our survival. These things happen automatically. We don't have control over them, but some of our choices can impact these systems. The autonomic nervous system is kind of divided into two separate systems. We have our sympathetics. These are also known as our fight or flight system. Think of these as our survival when we are in a state of possibly danger or some type of big traumatic event. Whereas, which is definitely part of survival, as well as the parasympathetics. And this might not be what you will think of when you think of survival. Usually when we think of survival, we think of against danger. But parasympathetics are our rest and digest system. And these are also just as important for the survival of the human race as fighting and flighting. Because rest and digest is so that we are able to recover, we are able to digest our few food and gain nutrients, as well as this is the same system that allows for sexual reproduction. So those are what are needed for any species in order to survive. So that's kind of what the autonomic nervous system is. So again, we have two divisions, sympathetics and parasympathetics. When we look at the way that the autonomic nervous system is designed, it has two parts. So each of these have two parts. The first is we have a cell. So here's my neuron, right? So this is going to be an autonomic nervous system neuron right here. We have a cell body that is within the central nervous system. So this is in the central nervous system. Then we have a really long axon, and that axon is going to synapse outside of the central nervous system in a thing called a ganglion. So a ganglion, what that word means is it is a group of cell bodies, CB means cell bodies, in the peripheral nervous system. So that is outside of the spinal cord, outside of the brain. So a ganglion, right, the dorsal root ganglion we heard of, that was a group of cell bodies outside of the spinal cord or the brain. So we have an axon in a cell, so a whole neuron that is in the central nervous system that then synapses with a group that's outside in the peripheral nervous system in a ganglion. And then it sends that fiber to whatever its target is. So it has two parts. That's it. It's just two parts. We call this part that's before the ganglion the pre-ganglionic neuron. And we call the thing after the ganglion our post-ganglionic neuron. So our preganglionic and our postganglionic. And I don't know what extent in lecture you'll have to know about preganglionic and postganglionic, but that's just the general idea. So one more time, just to review, a ganglion is a group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So that means outside of the brain or the spinal cord. In the autonomic nervous system, each of the neurons that are in either the sympathetics or parasympathetics have two parts. They have a preganglionic neuron with a cell body in the central nervous system and a postganglionic neuron with the cell body in the peripheral nervous system in the ganglion. And there we have it. Okay, so we have preganglionic, postganglionic. Now, where do we find all of these different things? So if I were to kind of draw the spinal cord, doopy-doopy-doo. So here's my pons, and then here's my medulla. We could think of this is kind of in the back of the medulla, and then it comes down, right? And we had our cervical, thoracic, lumbar. So I'm going to kind of draw a little bit like that. Not the most anatomically correct, but it's there. So on this side, I'm going to write where we find our sympathetics. And on this side, I'm going to write where I have my parasympathetics. So my sympathetics can be found, my preganglionic, these right here, of my sympathetics, these cell bodies right there, can be found within the spinal cord, and I'm kind of drawing them right here. So those are all the cell bodies in the spinal cord from T1 to L2 in what's known as the lateral horn. So the sympathetic cell bodies, preganglionic cell bodies, so I'll write that here. Preganglionic cell bodies for sympathetics is T1 to L2 in the lateral horn. So T1 to L2. I don't know if I counted enough dots, but that's where it's going. So that's where they start, and then they exit out of here, and they synapse in ganglions. And we're going to see a picture of that, a model of that in a second. But see how they're going to go to ganglions. And the ganglion has cell bodies outside of it. And then those are going to send them to things like our heart, to things like our adrenal glands. And we'll talk about what the adrenals do. To things like our stomach, anything like that. So it's going to send it to organs. Now, just like a clinical note, this is why people who stay in a sympathetic state, which is found a lot when people have really high anxiety, a lot of stress, they're in a sympathetic state constantly, they get a lot of tightness. So I'm a chiropractor, right? They get a lot of tightness in their thoracic spine, and that is the area where sympathetics are running. So the more you use an area, the more neurologic input in an area, the tighter the musculature in that area can also get. So it's kind of like a cause and react. And that, so if I were to adjust or massage an area or put some motion into an area in the thoracic spine, that can help reset the sympathetics a little bit. So that's just like a fun fact. And some people can feel that. They're like, oh yeah, I feel when I'm stressed out, my thoracic spine or kind of that space behind your lungs gets really tight. All right, so that is our sympathetics. Parasympathetics, my rest and digest. Now, it has 4 cranial nerve startings, okay? So it starts at up here with cranial nerve 3. It also is related to cranial nerve 7, which cranial nerve 7 was right here between the pons and the medulla. Cranial nerve 7, which is my facial nerve. Also related with cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, and cranial nerve 10, vagus. So my pre-ganglionic cell bodies for the parasympathetics can be found in cranial nerves 3, oculomotor, cranial nerve 7, facial, cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, and cranial nerve 10, vagus. It can also be found down here. Remember, this one went to L2. Well, if we go down a little deeper from S1 to S4, we will find other preganglionic cell bodies in those lateral horns. Those ones that are down there, that is because, like I said, it does rest and digest, so think digestion, down low, and then also sexual reproduction. And what's down low? Stuff for sexual reproduction. So that is also why the parasympathetics are involved. So again, preganglionic cell bodies are cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, 10, and the lateral horns from S1 to S4. And so that is just very common. That's kind of the base knowledge. Now we could go into like what kind of stuff is released in each of those. We could get really deep, but that's kind of the main ideas of what I want you to know in regards to how it works. So I want you to know that ganglion is where they synapse. I want you to know where the preganglionic cell bodies are found, and generally what are some of the things they do. So I just want to talk really briefly before we look at the images on this. what each of the cranial nerve ones do, because those ones are, if anything, the ones that you'll probably see questions on. So cranial nerve 3, oculomotor, when it's involved in the ANS, is going to be involved with our ciliary muscle. Or you could think of it as our sphincter pupillae. So those are fancy muscle names, but what they do is think about when you're resting and digesting. Do you want your eyes to be able to take in a lot of light or a little light? You would want your eyes to take in a little light so that you can relax. So when you're in a parasympathetic state, the ciliary muscle is going to actually close or undilate your eyes, whereas if you were sympathetic, your eyes would be dilated. So it's going to be kind of doing the opposite of the dilation. So that is what it does. So it is involved with the dilation of the eyes, specifically making it so it's not big and dilated, but the opposite. So that's what that one's involved with. Cranial nerve 7 is going to be responsible for, which is our facial nerve, just so that you remember that. It is going to be involved with our lacrimal gland. The lacrimal gland is our tear ducts. So those are near the lacrimal bone of our eye, as well as the serous mucus glands in our nose. So our mucus glands. So me getting a stuffy nose, right? It is also involved in the submandibular and sublingual glands. Submandibular and sublingual glands. What do those glands do? Digest food. We'll talk more about that in our digestion lab. And then cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, is going to have the parotid gland, which again is also related to digestion, making saliva. And then cranial nerve 10, vagus, we talked about a little bit. It's going to be related to the thoracic and abdominal ganglion. And so it's going to help with the mesenteric plexuses, which is a whole lot of balancing of our respiration, our digestion, and things like that. All right, now that was a whole lot of information. We'll go through a lot more in lab, and in lecture you'll go through this stuff too. So again, really brief thing. Let's look at just some images of where things are located. So here we see, this is me kind of looking at the side of the brain. Here was cranial nerve 1. Here we see cranial nerve 3, oculomotor. So cranial nerve 3, cranial nerve 7, which is at that space between my pons and my medulla. And then cranial nerve 9 and cranial nerve 10, vagus. So those are the cranial nerves involved in the autonomic nervous system. And then here you can kind of see in that model, this is where those cell bodies would start. And then outside of them, we have our ganglion. And so in our thoracic body, we have this sympathetic trunk ganglion, which is this group of ganglions where those secondary cell bodies are for our autonomic nervous system. So this one right here is that dorsal root ganglion that has sensory information. And then going vertically, we have our sympathetic trunk ganglia. So this was about me sensing things, and then motor stuff would come out on a different area. This itself is our actual sympathetic trunk. And so you can see that. And this is just a model instead of looking at the actual cadaver. We'll look at that in lab. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you in lab.